Welcome to Unraveling Behavior, a science podcast from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Hi everyone. Have you ever wondered how much the world is shaping your behavior without you even realizing it? From addictive junk food to endless scrolling and rampant misinformation, it can feel like we're trapped in a web of influences designed to undermine our autonomy and well-being. But what if we could push back? Today, we'll explore how we can resist these manipulative forces. Joining us is Ralph Hertwig, a leading expert in decision-making and director at our institute. We'll explore why empowering people to spot and resist manipulation is key to protecting our autonomy, and how behavioral science can help us improve our decision-making and self-control skills. Get ready for a fascinating discussion. Here's Ralph Hertwig. Hi, Ralph. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sophia. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me.
In your work, you've argued that highly commercialized environments, from fast food to social media, really need competent and empowered citizens. Could you explain why you believe that's so important?
Yes, that was indeed one of the arguments, and that is one of the important reasons why we need competent and empowered citizens. It's not the only one, but it's a very important one. And what I had in mind was that if you think about it, how our environment in the 20th century, 21st century has dramatically changed. I mean, think, for instance, of the digital environment, which didn't even exist 50 years ago. And today it has become so ubiquitous for us. But these environments are very sophisticated. They are constructed on the basis of a lot of scientific knowledge, actually. Some of it is psychological knowledge. And I've characterized these environments as ultra-processed environment. That term, ultra-processed, originally comes from the food environment. And in the food environment, we do speak of ultra-processed foods. And what we have in mind is that these are foods that are highly processed foods. They have lots of ingredients, typically the ones that we cannot even pronounce. And they often provide us with a combination of high sugar and high fat. And there's both the idea and evidence for it that these environments can be quite addictive. And there's even a recent study, 2023, that actually came out of one of the Max Planck Institutes that showed that ongoing consumption of high caloric and high fat and high sugar food actually changes the reward circuitry in our brain. And if you think about it just for a moment, if you think about it, that's amazing, because what it means is that the preferences as they are represented in our brain change, and they change systematically such that we actually, with time, prefer low-fat food less than we did before we started consuming high-fat, high-sugar food. And that is actually pretty amazing, that we, through the consumption of the food, suddenly develop different preferences that are not good to our nutritional health. And what that means is that in these environments, if we are confronted with these environments, and the food environment is of course only one. I mean, think about the digital environment and how sophisticated the digital environment is in grabbing our attention, in steering our behavior, in keeping us hooked to social media platforms and various apps and so on and so on. And what that means is that we do need competences to also preserve our autonomy in these environments. And with autonomy, I mean freedom of choice and also agency. So the ability to actually act and act according to our own desires and our own preferences and wills, and not just being pushed around by the commercial interests. Now, to avoid one misunderstanding, I would not be arguing this fixes the problem. We will not fix the problem of digital environments and the extent to which they are based on an attention economy only by competent citizens. We
These
need
are very
much more.
powerful forces.
These are extremely powerful forces. These are extremely powerful, and that's one of the terms that is being used, choice architectures. And also, if you think about the food environment. And in order to deal with these forces, we need more than making citizens competent. We need, for instance, also systematic approaches. We need regulation. We need laws. We may need also taxes. We need perhaps fat tax or sugar tax. So competences and empowerment is only one aspect of the whole story. But as we also know, these kind of regulations, systematic regulation, they take time. And of course, they are also subject to all kinds of powerful industry interests. And for that reason, I have argued that at least as a first line of response for the citizen, we need empowered and competent citizens.
And when you say we, who is we? So who empowers the citizens?
I would argue that public policymakers who also with the health and the well-being of citizens in mind should think about how they can put regulation in place or could put intervention in place that make people more competent, that help people to deal with these, as I called them, ultra-processed environments that are first and foremost designed with commercial and purely commercial interests in mind.
And what role do scientists play in this situation?
One of the developments that we have observed over the last, say, 10 to 20 years is that policymakers, politicians, become more and more interested in evidence that comes from psychology and it comes from economics and behavioral economics, because these fields know a lot about how people behave and also how can we guide people's behavior. And I think this is, and I should point it out, I think this is due to the work that has been started by Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, the inventors of a notion that is called nudging. And nudging is one approach to that's now called behavioral public policy making. What that means is that we can bring our knowledge of human behavior to the policymakers, to the politicians, and we can help them to fix certain problems. Problems such as how do we avoid waste or how do we increase organ donation. There are all kinds of public policy problems that need to be solved. And in the past, they were often solved through laws and regulations. And what in the last, say, 20 years has happened, that politicians have realized, and increasingly so, that there's a lot of knowledge about human behavior in psychology and economics, and that this knowledge can also be enlisted in order to come up with smart interventions.
What lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic do you think can be applied to global challenges like climate change or threats to democracy?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And for me, I would say the COVID crisis was also an eye-opener in the following sense, that a lot of what was expected from citizens during the pandemic was what one could call, and is often called in psychology and beyond, the importance of agency. So the importance of an active, responsible citizen who can responsibly face a challenge and deal with that challenge. Well, that sounds pretty abstract. What do I mean? Now, think back to the pandemic. There were a lot of things that we expected from citizens. We expected, for instance, as you may remember, to understand pretty complex terms.
Exponential growth.
That's one of them.
That was one.
Come on. Who would know what that exactly, at least before the pandemic, who would know what that is? But also, for instance, remember when the tests, the COVID tests came on the market, we needed to understand also notions such as what is a hit rate or what is a false alarm rate. We also needed to understand why is social distancing or physical distancing, as it was later called often, why is that so important? Why is it important, for instance, to quarantine yourself when there's the possibility that you got infected?
There was also a lot of misinformation, right?
Exactly. You're totally right. And remember, the WHO, they also spoke of the tsunami of misinformation in the context of the pandemic, which meant we also expected people to be able to search for good information, for accurate information. And this was also a situation of lots of uncertainty for many people. And one way to deal with uncertainty is to get information and to get good and accurate information that you could rely on. So what that meant is, and these are all examples where we wanted an active citizen. We wanted also a citizen with a sense of self-efficacy, of control over his or her behavior. Just think about it. What was expected from us, many of us were expected to work from home, which meant to really reconstruct our apartments, find places where we could work and how we can combine family life and our work life. We expected the person to be adaptive and to adapt to the challenges of the situation. And if you expect that kind of adaptability, then you put a premium on agency, because without an active citizen, you will not get that kind of adaptation that was absolutely necessary in that situation. Now, the argument that I would make is that a lot of the crises that we are currently facing, if you think about climate change and climate change adaptation, if you think about obesity, if you think about our behavior on digital platforms, where there's also a danger that we get addicted, that a lot of these challenges that we are facing require adaptability on our part. And for that, we need to invest into people. We cannot expect citizens to be competent and to be active players who take their fate in their own hand to some extent. I'm not arguing for a vision where the citizen is all by him or herself. Not at all. We need systemic approaches as well. We need good laws and regulations. We need very resilient institutions. That's all true. But we also need, as you see in the case of the pandemic, we also need the active and competent citizen.
This idea of empowering citizens by building their competences is a quite different approach to behavior change than simply nudging them in one direction. Can you break down what a nudge is? Maybe give us a few examples so we can better understand how it differs from empowering people.
I think that nudging, if you think about it, is a really novel and really interesting idea. And the question is, and we will discuss that later, what are the potential downsides of nudging? But originally, the idea of nudging was that people are really often challenged. They are making mistakes. They are maybe tend to be motivationally challenged. You could also say inert. We're suffering from inertia. And what that means is that if we want to change human behavior, maybe it's not the best idea to appeal to people. That was the assumption. But instead, maybe we can let the environment do the work. And in combination then with all the problems that people have, that specific combination of a smart environment and people as they are will create a power and a dynamic that pushes them in a certain direction. That was really the idea of nudging. And what it meant is that we should, first of all, not so much think about people, because we know who they are full of biases and errors and mistakes. But instead, what we should be really doing is to think about choice architectures, interesting way.
And could we also say choice environment instead of that's what architecture means,
That's
right?
Yeah, it's actually, it sounds a bit sophisticated, but you could also say choice environments. There is an emphasis on aspects of the choice environment to which we do not necessarily pay attention to, and yet these aspects of the environment nevertheless guide our behavior. What is also part of the choice environments are, for instance, economic incentives, taxes, fines. And that's not what they have in mind. They have in mind things that we typically often would not even think about, such as the ordering of stuff. We know that also from the supermarket. When you go into a supermarket, there's a famous slogan, eye level is buy level. So everybody, all producers try to get their products onto the eye level shelf, because the idea, and there's evidence behind it, that what is on eye level grabs our attention, is more likely to be purchased. So, but we may not necessarily even be aware of that. This is an effect from the environment that we may not fully be aware of, and yet it steers our behavior. And the idea was to look for these kind of features in the environment that steer our behavior, may possibly be even below our level of awareness, and yet have an impact on our behavior. And in combination with, say, the mistakes that we make, the errors we make, we may get pushed in certain directions that is, from the point of the policymaker, desirable for the individual. That was the idea of what's now has come to be called architectural nudges. And that's basically the most innovative and interesting class of nudges. There's a second class of nudges that's called educative nudges, and this typically includes things like warnings, think of the cigarette package, or disclosure of information, or reminders. Now, think about the adjective, educative. This is a very narrow interpretation of education. The nudges wanted to mark the fact that there are also other classes of nudges that are also important, such as reminders or warnings. But it is, in my view, a much too narrow interpretation of what we can achieve with something like education.
There is also one class of nudges that people may have heard about, defaults. So defaults would fall under the architectural category. Would you like to explain how the default would work? It's also a good example.
Yeah. Defaults is actually, I would say, one of the most powerful nudges there is. And there are some meta-analyses that suggest that defaults can have in some environments very powerful effects. Defaults is basically the idea that in certain choice situations, there's one option that is prefixed, that is predetermined by a choice architect. And if you don't do anything, if you do not decide any further, that option is being implemented for you. That sounds a bit abstract. Perhaps the most famous example is the notion of organ donation. There are countries which have what is called an opt-out default, which means that the policymaker declares everybody and anybody, starting with a certain age, to be an organ donor. And you, if you don't want to be an organ donor, have to explicitly opt out. But the default is, by definition, by law, everybody's an organ donor. That is in contrast to another system that is called an opt-in system, where you are not, by default, an organ donor, considered to be an organ donor, but you as a citizen make the decision at some point in your life that you may think organ donation is a really important public good and behavior, and I should do that, and then you opt into the system of organ donation. And that is, of course, quite different. The default, in one case, you are not an organ donor by definition, and in the other, you are. And the finding then was that in those countries that had an opt-out default, many more people, at least theoretically speaking, hypothetically speaking, could be organ donor. That doesn't mean that they actually are organ donors, but the reference class of people who could potentially be organ donors was much higher in the opt-out countries than in the opt-in countries. And so this was one of the fascinating examples that drew people's attention to nudging, because it seemed so easy that you just change the law.
And then people stick to the status quo.
And that was the assumption, because out of inertia, people stick to the status quo, and they suddenly, at least theoretically speaking, or hypothetically speaking, if push came to shove, they are organ donors. There's also some other interpretations of why defaults work. Sometimes it's also thought they work because they are read as implicit social recommendations about what is the desired course of action. So it's not just inertia, it could be also other reasons why defaults may work.
There is one term that is we often hear it in association with nudging, which is libertarian paternalism.
Yeah, that was
What does that mean?
Yeah, and this is an interesting concept because, of course, and that was the very point of it, these things seem to clash with each other. Libertarian means that we are stressing, emphasizing, preserving freedom of choice and preserving liberty. And on the other hand, paternalism, that's the idea that there may be a public choice architect or a public policymaker who knows what's good for you. And I will then make sure that you will do what I have considered to be good for you. And these two things, the emphasis on liberty of choice and liberty and the emphasis on paternalism, they don't go together. But here they do go together in the sense that in order to construct a choice architecture that is good for the person, that nudges the person in a particular direction, I need to be, or I end up being a paternalist because I tend to know what is good for you. And I design a choice architecture in a way that you will reveal and show a behavior that in the end is, so my assumption, good for you. But, and here comes the libertarian part, in this building a choice architecture, you still have the choice to act otherwise. Take the example of organ donation. In the opt-out situation, meaning you are by definition an organ donor, you still have the choice to say, you know what, I don't want to be an organ donor. I opt out of this system. So in this sense, you have a choice architecture that builds on people's inertia, that builds on people's status quo bias. They stick to what the default is. And yet, they do not exclude that a person, of course, chooses against it. And in this sense, you suddenly have the marriage of paternalism and liberty. And that was the idea of libertarian paternalism, which is, if you will, the underlying political philosophy that was created in the context of nudging.
So I think this provides a good transition for us to talk about the criticisms that have been raised against nudging. So what are the main concerns with that?
From my point of view, what I would criticize in nudging is in particular the neglect of agency. There's also, of course, the criticism that we are also undermining autonomy defined here as freedom of choice, to the extent that people may not be even aware that they are being nudged. And that is a criticism that, of course, holds particular in situations where nudging occurs without people becoming necessarily aware that they are being nudged. I find the agency argument even more important, and that goes back to what we discussed in the context of COVID-19. This situation clearly required an active citizen, and not just an active citizen, an active and competent citizen, also a citizen who was able to take responsibility for his or her own behavior, but also think about the others. And we needed to exercise responsibility. So you needed competences, you needed agency, and you needed also a responsibility for others. And I would argue that nudging has not invested in these skills. Nudging typically doesn't try to make people competent. And the idea is obvious to the extent that the choice architecture interacts with the problems that people have and actually builds on them. Like, remember the inertia argument? I want people to stick to the default in the organ donation case. I don't want them to opt out and not become organ donors.
So you want to make use of the way the mind works,
exactly,
right? In order to get people to do the right thing.
Exactly. And for that, so first of all, it needs a certain view of the mind, and we can talk about that. And that view that nudging tends to be a rather negative view. And at the same time, I don't want to change that because I need, for the defaults to work, I need an inert citizen. For other effects to work, I need a person who is loss averse. For other effects to work, I need a person who neglects base rates. These are all potential cognitive illusions that have been discussed in the literature. And for a lot of these nudging interventions to work, I need to basically exploit or to some extent take advantage of these cognitive illusions because they together with the choice architectures, lead to the behavior that I consider to be the right one for the person in question.
You've also mentioned before that the nudging approach is based on this deficit model of human nature. And this is a model that is not universally agreed upon. Would you like to tell us a bit more about this and about the research that inspired the nudging approach?
The research is basically anchored in a very successful research tradition in psychology that is called the Heuristics and Biases program. And that was originally started and for many years also actively done by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Now, the idea in that research was that people, because of their cognitive limitations, they often need to rely on relatively simple heuristics, simple choice strategies and decision strategies. And these heuristics, can be quite good, but they also lead us to make systematic errors and biases. What I would say that what happened over the years and decades is that many psychologists, but not only psychologists, also economists and behavioral economists, got very much fascinated by that message that people commit biases and errors. You could have interpreted Kahneman and Tversky also differently, namely that there are heuristics that often work quite good. But as far as I can tell, in that research tradition, there was hardly any attempt paid to working out when heuristics work well. There was more or less the sole, I would even say, fixation and fascination was with the kind of cognitive errors and biases. The term that was coined was cognitive illusions. So there emerged the view that people and human cognition is profoundly error-prone, and there's even a famous statement by Dick Thaler, one of the authors of the Nudge book, that mental illusions is the rule rather than the exception. And I would disagree with that, because this is a rather negative and exclusively negative portrayal of human cognition. And the second assumption was that not only are they so ubiquitous, but we can also not correct them. And they are so stubborn, these mistakes and errors. And because we cannot correct them, we cannot really train people to overcome them. We cannot, and that was the term often being used, we cannot debias people. And because we cannot debias them, it seems like it's not worth investing into human capital, into helping people to make better decisions by overcoming these potential biases.
Instead, you make use of them.
Exactly. That's, in a way, that's the trick. We don't even try to overcome them. No, we think about choice situations where these biases and mistakes and errors and our problems work in our favor together with the choice architecture.
But not everyone agrees with the way that the heuristics and biases program studies human thinking, right? What other perspectives exist?
Interestingly, in the 1950s and 60s, and this is shortly before Kahneman and Tversky they began their work in the early 1970s, there was a very encompassing and also empirically working research enterprise. And these authors had a totally different view. And important thing, they also talked about statistical reasoning. They talked about statistical intuitions. So they talked about the same subject as Kahneman and Tversky, yet they arrived at a totally different conclusion about how good or bad people are. Here, there's a research field based on many experiments that says, well, people are really good intuitive statisticians. And then just a few years later, Kahneman and Tversky basically turned that around and arrived at a totally different conclusion. And a very interesting question is, how can that be? One important difference, and that's an important difference that a colleague of mine, Thomas Lejarraga, and myself worked out in a paper a few years ago, was that the experimental methodology with which we studied statistical intuitions totally changed. In Kahneman's Tversky tradition, you often have text-based vignettes, and basically you give one answer and you're done. And that's it. And in the tradition of the mind as an intuitive statistician, the experiment was very different. You were not asked to just give one judgment, but often you gave tens sometimes even hundreds of judgments. And what I could do across the time, I could also study the learning of people. And these kind of experiments, which are much more rooted in our experience and also provide more learning opportunities, feedback, that these kind of experiments led to very different conclusions about people's cognition and statistical reasoning abilities. What many researchers did, and to some extent I would also say Kahneman and Tversky did, was inviting the inference that based on these errors and biases, human cognition in general is flawed. So we are making on the basis of a very specific kind of experimental stimuli, where we exclude learning, we make inferences about the general ability of people to reason and also to learn. And I think this is inappropriate. This is too much. This is an overgeneralization. So what I would argue is that we have two different views, and now we can to some extent say something about cognition, but we should not overgeneralize because we are only saying something about one class of situations. So in other words, I think if we put them together, these two views, we may get a much better and much more representative understanding of people's learning and cognitive abilities. What happened in the 1950s and 60s then happened again in the work that was also done at this institute, in particular by Gerd Gigerens and the ABC group, but also then continued by our group, is to think about the positive aspects of heuristics. Heuristics, remember, are these simple strategies that people use when they deal with complex situations, when they deal with little information, when they have to make decisions under time pressure. We call them ecologically rational heuristics, sometimes also fast and frugal heuristics, where many of these examples have been developed that demonstrate that under certain circumstances and when the right heuristic is used in the right environment, that they can lead to incredibly good performance. And that again is another example of a research tradition and research field that suggests it may be totally worth thinking about how we can help people to make better decisions. They can learn and we can get better in our decision making.
You've contributed to a behavioral science approach designed to empower citizens, which you refer to as boosting. Could you define what boosting is and give us a few examples?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of boosting is really to come up with interventions that are designed to improve people's competences. And when I say competences, I have a rather broad understanding of competences. I mean cognitive competences, but they could also be emotional, motivational, they could be behavioral competences. And we can do so either by really building on what is already there in terms of competences and try to foster them further, or we could also try to really build new competences that a person may not have had up to this point. And we can do that both by turning to the internal operation of the mind, our cognition, but we can also, of course, make use of the environment and treat the environment as an ally and bring them also into the game. But the idea in the end, the major idea is that we believe that people can make better decisions and we help them to make better decisions by boosting these competences.
Can you share a few examples?
The examples that I have in mind or that I will give you, they are also quite different in terms of, you could call them the setup costs, the time it takes to learn them. Because you could say, well, boosting sounds like, that takes a lot of effort, time, and people may be turned off by it. And I would argue there are boosts that are incredibly easy to pick up and to learn. And
they can be learned in a podcast, isn't it?
They can be learned in a podcast. Let me give you one example.
Go ahead.
It's called the Dutch Reach. The problem is this one. The problem is what's called dooring. Dooring is the problem that as a car driver, you park your car at the side of the street and you want to leave your car and then you are distracted because you have to look for your kid and you have to turn on the radio and where's my cell phone and so on. And you don't pay enough attention to what is happening behind you and you just open the door and suddenly a very unfortunate bicyclist may run into your door. That's what's called dooring. This could lead to really, really bad accidents, and people get severely injured when that happens. And the question is, how can we overcome that? And now I could, of course, use nudging. Nudging would say, like educative nudges. I could warn you, just don't do that. But that's the very problem. In the situation, we forget. You may have warned me 5 minutes ago, but in a situation, I may have forgotten. What if we tell you not to open the door with the hand that is next to the door handle, but actually with the other hand? And if you do that, if you reach over with your hand that is further away from the door, you cannot help but turn slightly around. And that serves the purpose.
So you will see if a cyclist is coming.
Exactly. Now, you could say, well, but even that need to be remembered. That is absolutely true. So at some point it may become a routine and you don't even need to think of it and you just do it. But in order to foster that process of ritualizing it, what we do is that we make we give you a little memory cue. So for instance, what you do, you put a little red ribbon on the door handle. And so when you look down and want to open the door, you see the red ribbon and, right, I'm supposed to use the other hand. This is a very simple boost. This is a very simple intervention that, however, can be very effective in reducing the risk and the incidences of dooring. That would be one example of a boost. And here we are dealing with a public policy problem, which is dooring. Okay, that's one example. Here's a different example. It's basically the idea of can we deal with math anxiety. Now, math anxiety is something that you can observe across many, many societies. And it's basically that you become anxious when it is about numbers, when it's about equations, when it's about arithmetic content. And this math anxiety can both compromise your success in school, but then if you extend that into your professional career, it also can affect you, the career choices that you make, and even whether you go to university or not. So it can have an important impact also on your economic well-being and your life satisfaction. Here's a very simple intervention, and it goes back to the beautiful work by a group of developmental psychologists from Chicago University and Columbia University, if I remember correctly. And they had the idea that why wouldn't parents, when they bring their kids to bed in the evening, couldn't they read very simple stories that have some mathematical content, so some number content? Basically, what happens if you read these little stories, fairy tales to your child, that this is a very playful way of engaging with numbers, and that prevents building up math anxiety to begin with. This is something that even parents can do who themselves are math anxious, because the content is so simple. And also, of course, you can then build up the complexity of the content with the age of the child. So there are lots of different stories, and you can download them through an app. And in one of the studies that they did, they found that within a school year, if you regularly read the math stories to your child, then the children, in terms of the math performance, have a 3-month advantage relative to the children who are not being exposed to these math stories. And this is an enormous effect. And this is a more engaging, a more time-consuming boost, if you will. But still, it's a very simple one. And if you think about the effectiveness, this is really amazing. And again, we're dealing with a public policy problem, math anxiety, that really also compromises the economic success of both children, but also of the adults in terms of their professional choices that they make. If we had a solution for that, wouldn't that be fantastic? Now that's a solution, and that is a solution that really assumes that we can help people, we can foster their competences. And I'm fascinated by that, by those findings. And I think it's just a forward-looking intervention I love to talk about. Now, and here's a third example coming again from a very different area. This is the area that we often talk about these days, misinformation. We talked about that earlier, Sophia, in terms of COVID. The WHO spoke of the tsunami of misinformation. But we not only have it in the context of COVID, but also in the context of climate change and in many other areas as well. And now, how do you, as a person who is looking for information and want to read up on a certain topic, how do you make sure that the website that, for instance, you are looking at is credible and provides you with credible information? And there's a really excellent, wonderful educational scientist from Stanford University, Sam Weinberg, who came up with what he calls lateral reading. Lateral reading is basically the idea that can we provide people with the competence to do what professional fact checkers do? What does that mean? Now, here's how they started out, how Sam Weinberg started out. He gave his Stanford students and even some of his colleagues the task to look at particular websites, and actually a number of them, and to figure out whether they are credible or not. And it turned out neither the students nor the professorial colleagues were actually really good at that task. They were really bad. They were not much better than chance. And why is that? Now, what he found is that the reason is that people love to engage with the content. They stay on that website. They read what is written there. They look at whether does it look professional? Is the graphics nice? Is the design good? Logos, are there references? And if all these are met, if you can cross it off, then you may conclude that I can trust it. So you put a lot of cognitive effort into figuring out whether I can trust the content. And it turns out that this is not a good strategy. It's not a good strategy.
It's easy to fake.
Exactly. That's the point. It's easy to fake. And so what is a better strategy? And what Sam Weinberg argued that after observing what fact checkers do is, what they tend to do is they don't look at the content, but they immediately leave that website. They leave it open on a tab, but they open other tabs. And basically they read up on what is being said about the people or the institution, the agency that produced this particular website. And then you may find out, for instance, that reports, for instance, on climate change and climate change information and discusses whether it's human-made or caused through other factors or doesn't happen at all. And you find out that other websites inform you that the group who's behind that information is considered to be financed by the fossil industry. And that, of course, puts the whole information that you receive in a slightly different light, because you now can see that maybe some of the information was also driven by interests and lobbying and other aspects. So the idea is that you are not investing all your cognitive resources into the text that it's in front of you, but you try to get more additional information that the internet easily provides you with.
And the name Lateral comes from the fact that you're opening another tab.
Exactly.
Right? You go sideways.
Yes, we go sideways. We're not doing the vertical reading, which would be staying on the side and trying to understand it. But here we are doing something different. We are actually ignoring that. We actually called that critical ignoring. We are ignoring this information, and we are laterally looking for other information that helps us to very quickly come to the conclusion whether it's credible or not. This is only one of the competences that you need in order to today to deal with a digital information-rich environment, but it can be quite an important one, and it's a competence that is totally worth having.
So here we have the possibility, the citizen has the possibility to adopt the boost or not adopt the boost, right? It's entirely transparent. This is very different from nudging.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is one of the important differences between nudging and boosting, because if you think about all these examples, whether it's the Dutch Reach, lateral reading, or whether it's the bedtime stories, all these things only work with the agreement, also the full comprehension, and with the cooperation of the person who wants to engage in the boost. And that means two aspects. Boosts need to be totally transparent. They need to be transparent in how they work and need to be transparent in their objective. What do they want to reach? And to some extent, they require the person to also cognitively and motivational engage with them. So in this sense, boosts require agency and require also some motivation to reach the objective that is being assumed in the boost.
And what can you say about their longevity?
We know too little about the longevity of all of the interventions that we're talking about, whether it's nudging or whether it's boost, or also in many other interventions. We don't quite know at what point there's a decline in the effects. That's big, and the reason for that is we have too little studies. But we can nevertheless step back and think conceptually about the longevity of the boost. Now, the hope, of course, is that with a particular boost, once it is in place, and once it's also, for instance, routinized, think, for instance, of the Dutch reach, that this is a behavior that is being in place for quite a long time. Because it is, and that's the idea, it's independent of a particular choice architecture. You have learned to do that, and you can, in any car that you sit, in any car that you enter, you can apply it. It's generalizable to any car that you are using. And in that sense, at least conceptually speaking, boosts are built to last, and nudges depend on the presence of the choice architecture, and therefore are subject to changing choice architectures and also to changes in the intention of the choice architect.
You've proposed that self-nudging can help people control their own behavior and resist temptations. How does self-nudging work and what makes it a boost?
So self-nudging is something that I really love. My colleague and I, and my colleague in this case is Samuel Hertwig, who is a philosopher from Finland, from Helsinki. And I thought about how we think about nudging. It also occurred to us, is it only the public choice architect who can make those changes in a choice architecture? No, because it could be us. We could be and actually not could be, we are the masters of our choice architecture. Think about that. And once you understand that, this is really powerful. Because think, for instance, about your kitchen. I bet your refrigerator looks like mine. If you open it up, then the salad and the vegetable tends to be in this opaque drawer on the bottom. And if you are like me, then by the end of the week, you remember, oh yes,
they're still there.
Yes, didn't I buy something like? And you open it up and you see, oh God, it doesn't look so good anymore. Maybe even rotten. And that happens to me all the time. That happened to me all the time. It doesn't happen to me anymore. Because, I mean, this is, why does it happen? Because it is it's not eye level, right? It's on the bottom and you can't even see it. You forget about that. But we can undo that. We can change that immediately by saying that we take the vegetables and the fruit and put it up on eye level and put it in containers that are not opaque, but that are made out of glass, and you can really see what's in it. And you can even pre-slice them, the bits and pieces, so that even you reduce all kinds of friction when it comes to actually consuming. And when you open the refrigerator a little bit hungry and want to eat something, then of course you don't want to think about cutting and peeling and so on, but it should be all there. And we can do that. And what that means is that as citizen choice architects, and that's the notion that we coined, I mean, that we are also choice architects. We are the choice architects of our proximate environment, of what is around us. And
including the digital one.
And that's a very powerful one where we have lots of degrees of freedom of how we do that, whether we turn on notifications or not, whether we declare certain pages to be the default pages. And there are so many degrees of freedom where we can act as choice architects. And the important thing is, let's act as choice architects in a way that's conducive to our well-being. Self-nudging also requires, and that's why in my view it is a boost, and it's actually a fantastic boost, requires that we share some of the knowledge about human behavior that has been collected in terms of nudging. We share it with the person, we share it with the individual, we empower the person to be the choice architect. And this has lots of positive downstream consequences, because it means that the person can really choose the choice architecture that fits to his or her objectives. It can also mean that I can stop the self-nudging if I feel like I no longer need it, or it's no longer conducive to my interests. And self-nudging builds on the notion of competences that I share with you. And there's one maybe final aspect that I find very, very important. That's agency again. Remember, we talked about the importance of agency. The citizen choice architect is an active person, because he or she thinks about and may even experiment with the environment and see what aspects of the environment of which I didn't even think that it would affect me. It took me so long to finally understand the reason why I'm forgetting about the fruit and the vegetable in the refrigerator is because it's sitting in that damn drawer at the bottom, and it's also opaque. So of course I forget it during the week. And just to realize that these little aspects, it's not a huge aspect of environment, it's rather little, can have this enormous impact on our behavior. That's empowerment. And I want this kind of empowerment to share with people and to put them in a situation where they can make strategic changes in their proximate environment.
What sort of competences do you think make an empowered public today? And what sort of boosting interventions can help people develop these skills?
I think there are some very obvious domains that we should think about. These days, and again, think about the pandemic, we are often dealing with uncertainty and probabilistic information, with medical tests. We are dealing with health statistics. And a lot of the most important decisions that we take in our life deal with our health. And they are profound, and they are often difficult to make. Let's make sure that people understand the important information that they receive, for instance, from healthcare professionals. And we can do that. There are existing boosts, such as they are called fact boxes or icon arrays, or we can also train people in terms of, for instance, better formats of probabilistic information. It's often called natural frequencies. And we can empower people to actually convert the information into natural frequencies, from probabilities into frequencies. In another area where we can also help people by building their competences is a lot of financial decisions that we make. There are really interesting studies that suggest that we can help micro-entrepreneurs who often have problems with accounting for their finances and having enough insight in the incoming money and the outgoing money. And we can train them with very simple accounting heuristics so that they make, by the end of the month, they have a much better understanding of the money that comes in and the money that goes out. We talked already about the example of misinformation and disinformation. So these often toxic information environments in the digital world also require competences. And there are all kinds of interventions that are boosting based. Some of them are called psychological inoculation. Lateral reading was another example. Another aspect that can also be taught is actually something that we call critical ignoring. So think about it in a digital world, and that's a competence. Critical sounds funny, but it's a real competence, because critical ignoring enables us to see that certain things and certain players, also in particular in the digital world, try to hijack our attention. That's the whole notion of the attention economy. And sometimes we are better off in this world where a lot of the digital information products are packaged up in a certain way to attract our attention. For instance, by providing us with emotion, by providing us with supposedly very novel content, by providing us with a negative framing. These are all hot buttons that are being pushed to attract our attention. And sometimes the best defense is critically ignoring this. which doesn't mean ignoring. It means critically ignoring means to smartly ignore, to really think about what is informational food that I should not eat, that I should not consume. I should ignore it. That's the notion of critical ignoring. Here's another example. We can also boost people in their ability to reach their goals by giving them motivational skills and motivational competence. So one simple example is, for instance, temptation bundling. And we all know that experience that I should exercise a little bit and should go on the bike, on my stationary bike, but damn. And what has been shown in the literature is that if we do something that's called temptation bundling, which again is a competence, namely that we commit ourselves to being on the bike, and while we are being on the bike, we, for instance, watch our favorite TV show, and we only do it while we are on the bike. That's called temptation bundling. So that makes that easier for us to do something that we do not like to do, by at the same time reinforcing us and allowing us to do something that we love to do. And that's smart. And that's also, again, going back to this notion of the citizen choice architect. We are creating an environment for ourselves that makes it easier for us to reach the things that we would like to do. So these are a few domains, few examples, but they already illustrate that the sky is the limit. We can use boosting in all kinds of domains.
Where can citizens learn about boosts?
There are very different ways to inform citizens about potential boosts. And of course, that could be very traditional. We could use brochures, we can use fact boxes, but there are other ways of doing it. For instance, I can make use of apps. There's a fantastic app that has been developed in this institute that's called 1 Second. I'm not owning any shares in the app, so I'm as a private person, I say that I find this really an interesting app because it helps us to basically deal with that very question, namely that we are drawn to particular social media sites that we are using possibly too often. And this app is a self-nudging app that actually creates just a little bit of friction and thereby makes it easier for us to control our consumption. And sometimes the public policy maker can think about institutions that could provide boosts. For instance, the Dutch Reach is regularly taught and instructed in driving schools. So if you think about the structure of a society, there are all kinds of entry points where you could enter boosts. And actually, some of the boosts could even be, of course, also taught in kindergarten and can taught in schools. And of course, at many other places as well.
What are the requirements for applying boosting interventions in a way that is fair and responsible?
One thing, and this is an important point for me, that I don't want boost to be misunderstood as is blaming the individual. Often it's really the environment around us that triggers particular behaviors, that leads us down certain pathways. And so it's important that boosting doesn't mean to blame the individual. Rather, the other way around, what we want is we want to provide you with competences to deal with what we in the beginning have called ultra-processed environments. Very often we need to complement the formation of competences also with systemic changes. Like, for instance, the example that I gave you about being boosted to act as a citizen choice architect in my own kitchen. That's good and that's great, and it may help me to eat healthier food. But if you think about the ubiquitous food environment and the ultra-processed offers that are out there in the world, we need much more than the empowered citizen. We also need systematic regulation. But keep in mind, systematic regulations tend to be slow, and sometimes they are also perhaps not only sometimes, they are often subject to lobbying interest. So you may not necessarily get the best regulations that there could, or at least the ones where the scientific consensus suggests that these are the ones that should be in place. And again, that means that there, as a first resort, we do as a first line of defense, we also need boosting, in my view. I think one aspect is important. that, and very often I hear that when I talk about boosting, is that people say that you need certain cognitive requirements and you need also certain motivational requirements. So you need people who want to change their behavior, and you need people who are able to change their behavior. And I would say, yes, that is correct. But let's also make clear that in many of the cases that we talked about, these are minimal requirements. So think, for instance, about the Dutch Reach. The Dutch Reach is something that can be picked up by anyone who can get a driver's license. You don't need to be a rocket scientist in order to pick that up. And I think that's important, that we are thinking about boosts in a way that they are really accessible for many people. Now, I would say the Bedtime Story app is also a good example. Kids are being asked questions on the basis of the stories, and the answers are provided so that even potentially anxious parent can use that material. And in the process, him or herself may overcome their math anxiety. And isn't that fantastic? So this is another example where if we do it smartly, these boosts, we can really reduce the entry barriers to the use of these boosts. One of the arguments that sometimes is being raised is that boost would boost the inequality in society because only certain groups of people would be able to engage with them. And I would argue, I cannot exclude that this happens. But what I would argue is that if we build them smartly, we actually can also use them to overcome some of the problems of inequality. Think again about the example of math anxiety.
Ralph, before we wrap up, I would like to give you the chance to speak directly to two groups. So first, if policymakers were listening, what would you want them to take away from this conversation? And second, what's your message for everyday people? People who want to take control of their lives and make better decisions for themselves and for society.
If I were to address policymakers, and sometimes I do, then I think what is really important to me is that I wish and I hope to persuade them, to convince them with the arguments that they should also reflect on their fascination with what we have called the deficit model of cognition. It's this fascination with people are making mistakes, blunders, cognitive illusions, mental, and so on and so on. Yes, these exist. Some of them are debated, but they do exist. But people have also the ability to learn. And I think we need to harness this potential to learn. Also because, and that comes to the second point, that we need people who show agency. A lot of the problems that we have cannot be solved by the government and state alone, and cannot be solved by putting choice architectures in place. Because think about it. Some of the choice architectures we have control over. And if we are benevolent choice architects, we have control over that. But there are many choice architectures we have no control over. And we need to equip people with the abilities to also deal with these countless other commercially constructed choice architectures. These are the 2 points. The importance of overcoming the fascination with the dark side of human beings, the cognitive dark side of human beings, and secondly, the importance of agency. And to people, I would just say, yes, we can, to cite a famous statement by some American president. And with that, what I mean is that I want to instill the spirit that we don't have to accept the world as is, and we can change, we can learn, we can adapt. And what I also find important in that context, and that's the importance about boosting, is that as policymakers, we need to enter a conversation with people. We should no longer leave them in the dark about the process of behavior change, because they need to take ownership of that process as well. And that means we need to also trust people, and we need to show respect. And I think if we as policymakers show respect and also give the benefit of the doubt and trust, we will be, I hope we will be richly repaid.
Well, this has been a very nice conversation, very insightful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for these wonderful questions.
It was great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. We explored how tackling manipulation, climate change, pandemics all require empowered, capable citizens. As Ralph Hertwig explained, nudges alone won't get us there. We need to move beyond nudging to boosting, helping people develop the skills they need to make informed decisions that truly align with their goals. But boosting isn't enough on its own. It must be part of a broader approach that includes incentives and regulations. Thanks for listening and supporting science. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you soon.